seminar in our series of decision-making under deep uncertainty. And the topic today is development, application, and uses of scenario planning in decision-making under deep uncertainty. And this seminar series is developed with support from the Delta Science Program to explore concepts and present tools related to this field of DMDU, I'm going to call it, since I've said it twice already. And we're really hoping that this can help managers and stakeholders and interested parties evaluate and plan for a wide range of plausible futures in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And this is going to inform a review that the ISB is working on. And remember that prospectus has now been finalized and is available if you want more information. So just a quick reminder, decision-making under deep uncertainty is the exploration of tools that we might use to anticipate risk and inform decisions, even when we don't have a strong understanding of how likely those future risks may be. And within this field, scenario planning is a key tool for such investigations. And so the purpose of this and next month's semester is to try to understand these methods a little better and help us understand if there's ways we can get more out of scenario planning efforts. Because even though scenarios are widely used already to expand our minds about what is possible, they can also be limited by our blind spots and other common ways of thinking that tend to constrain our thinking. And so that's what our speakers today are going to dive into in this third seminar of our series. We have with us today Andrew Parker, who's a senior behavioral and social scientist at the RAND Corporation and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. And Jody Wong is an associate policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. And she's going to be discussing the development and application of scenarios and their uses at DMDU. Well, both of them are. They've divided the talk up into two. Dr. Parker will provide some of the fundamentals of scenario-based planning and the benefits of using scenarios to understand risk. And Dr. Wong will use case studies to show how scenarios can serve as communication tools, develop shared understanding of key uncertainties, and support decisions. So they're going to take about half the time, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions afterward. So let me now turn it over to Andrew Parker to start us off. Don't forget to unmute, Andrew.
Thank you. Are you seeing the slides now?
Yes.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having us present today. I'm Andy Parker. I'm a senior behavioral scientist at RAND. My research focuses on the psychology of decision-making, and especially how people make decisions under risk and uncertainty. And a portion of this work is focused specifically on deep uncertainty. For example, I co-led an NSF-funded project into the psychological effects of using scenarios rather than forecasts for long-range planning, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But before I get there, I'd like to give Jody a chance to introduce herself.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. I'm Jody Wong. I'm an associate policy researcher at the RAND Corporation. I'm a risk communication scientist, and my research leverages on principles from both communication and psychology to understand how people make decisions in uncertain environments and how to communicate complex information on different topic issues to different audiences. Most of my work are focused on the public health arena and in the environmental space. Recently, I've been working with my colleague Rob Lampert in the DMDU space, who I'm sure you've heard a lot about if you're a DMDU practitioner. And we're really beginning to explore how uncertainty might be actionable in media narratives.
Great, thanks, Jody. I always like to start talks like this letting you know what perspective you're getting. Jody and I are experts in the psychology and communication around decision-making. We've each worked on projects involving deep uncertainty with folks who are expert practitioners. So as Jody mentioned, you've likely met Rob Lampert, a collaborator of both of ours. That said, neither of us are DMDU practitioners ourselves. So what you're getting here is a well-informed view of how these issues play out in decision support surrounding deep uncertainty. I'm going to kick us off focusing on cognition, cognitive biases, and how it plays out in scenario-based decision-making. I'll discuss how that may be different from more traditional forecast-based decision-making and provide you with some relevant examples. Jody will then build off this, focusing on risk communication in the face of deep uncertainty, its challenges, its promises, and how scenarios fit in. And we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So my end goal here is cognitive biases. But to get there, I need to lay some groundwork. First, I'll spend a bit of time talking about how people, real people, which includes both planners and the public, make decisions under uncertainty, including deep uncertainty. Then I'll dive into what we mean by scenario-based planning and the promise of it from a psychological perspective before getting into the meat of it, which is cognition and cognitive bias. And I'll end with an example from our own research, as well as a set of cautions. Over the years, there's been intense interest in decision support approaches to help planners improve their ability to make many types of difficult decisions, such as when considering uncertain long-term environmental changes. To understand differences between scenario-based and traditional forecast-based approaches, it's useful to consider the broad set of elements key to effective decision-making processes. And the figure on the right is just a very simple characterization of some of those processes. We often spend most of our time talking about choice processes, which includes actually selecting the best decision among available options. But implicit in that are a variety of evaluative processes where we evaluate the potential consequences of those options. And even more implicit at times are decision structuring tasks. These are tasks that include defining the problem in a way that opens it up through meaningful consideration, objectives that we want to achieve, assembling a menu of options that might achieve those objectives, and identifying any key sources of uncertainty. I should note here that the term decision structuring is often used in two quite different ways. One of those is equivalent to decision architecture, meaning design choices made by a decision analyst in helping decision makers structure the decision that they're facing. The other are decisions made by the decision makers themselves on how they want to think about the problem that they're facing. For the most part, I'm talking about the second one here, how people frame a decision problem themselves. But when we get into talking about prescription, this does get into choice architecture. I'll argue that traditional approaches focus primarily on choice and evaluation, but many real-life decisions focus as much on discovering information and designing new alternatives as it is to making the final choice. This is particularly true under deep uncertainty, where decision makers have uncertainty regarding the very nature of the problem that they're facing. So scenario, at least the way I'm using it here, is a set of future states of the world presented to decision makers as a plausible and worthy of consideration, but without initially assigning any likelihood. Scenarios often come with a clear and often narrative policy orientation. Scenarios arguably may facilitate decision structuring, at least in early stages of deliberation. However, as a cautionary note, it's worth noting that there are concerns, obviously, that scenarios may prove insufficient for effective choice, particularly when decision makers may ultimately require likelihood information about alternative futures to choose among decision options. In some more quantitatively oriented DMDU approaches, which you may have been hearing about, likelihood does enter the process, but later once choices need to be made. But initially, the exploration and narrative surrounding scenarios could potentially benefit decision structuring. Certainly, this scenario literature and scenario proponents argue that this is especially helpful for contentious group decision making. Excuse me. There's a quote that I like from WAC that really captures a lot of the proposed promise of scenarios. That is that scenarios can change decision makers' assumptions about how the world works, compelling them to reorganize their mental models of reality. This makes reference to a very old concept from psychology, that of mental models, which is a network of beliefs about something. It could be a risk, a process, or a decision that they have to make. And mental models are a useful way of organizing the world mentally and can act as a shortcut for decision making. So the idea of that scenarios have the potential to help decision makers form one or more mental models of the situation they're facing is a powerful concept. In terms of the proposed promise of scenarios, there are several things that people point to. First, when faced with deep uncertainty, a single future or distribution of futures may be more easily rejected by stakeholders with opposing views. Scenarios that focus on multiple distinct futures may help get stakeholders on board and engaged. Relatedly, if presented as possibilities rather than firm predictions, such scenarios may be psychologically less threatening, thus make it easier for decision makers to explore new decision options that might effectively address inconvenient or contentious futures. Concreteness really, in my mind, cuts both ways. Scenarios may draw attention to small probability, high consequence outcomes, which can be attended to by decision makers, but at the same time could mislead decision makers that such low probability scenarios are more likely than they actually are. More generally, the way information is presented can affect several things psychologically. It can affect how intuitively or systematically users process information, what they regard as default options, their focus or lack of focus on worst cases, and their willingness to invest in protective measures. To go on, if decision makers are invested in a given policy option, scenarios have the potential to explicitly build that into deliberation. And finally, to the extent that likelihood is brought to decision support at a later stage, this is typically characterized across rather than within scenarios, and this likely changes how uncertainty is mentally represented. Should be clear at this point, but our main argument here is that this choice of pursuing scenario-based versus forecast-based approaches doesn't just matter from a decision analysis perspective, it matters psychologically about how people approach a problem. Perhaps most importantly, the decision maker's view of the decision will be shaped by the task they face. From a decision architecture perspective, how it's presented by a decision analyst will affect how they approach the problem. Individually, the mental model the decision maker adopts for the decision will affect this. More generally, there's a truism in psychology that behavior is a function of task in person. Specifically, it's the interaction of task in person. So in this case, the decision-making behavior is a function of the decision task they face and the decision maker. From a task perspective, is the future singular or multiple? Is likelihood placed at the forefront or does it play a secondary role? Is the starting point expectation or policy? This is often mirrored in cognitive processes. So we might ask, is the decision maker focused on likelihood or possibility? Is the perspective one of an average future or multiple futures? And is future diversity more concrete or more abstract? Whoa, excuse me there. Behavioral decision research is a field originated in psychology, but has strong threads in economics, business, engineering, and other fields. This research has often focused on the many pitfalls in human decision-making, especially when talking about narrow conceptualizations of complex problems, and especially when uncertainty is not well structured. Indeed, a central tenet of this field is the contrast between a descriptive account of human behavior and normative models of decision-making, such as those coming out of economics, statistics, or engineering. I provide here a few examples of the types of cognitive biases that might come into play when we're talking about scenario-based approaches. People typically bias their processing of information towards prior beliefs. This can take the form of differential information search and consideration, which is sometimes called confirmation bias, or interpretation of available evidence, which is sometimes called my-side bias. Psychological distance is a mechanism that may also flavor evaluation and perceived likelihood. Arguably, traditional approaches typically require users to agree on probability distributions prior to evaluating the desirability of alternatives, and this may be difficult with contentious groups. Secondly, there's a general tendency for people to overestimate their own knowledge. This is actually the scientific definition of overconfidence. Overconfidence gets worse as tasks get more challenging, as you would expect them to be under deeper uncertainty. This is true for individuals, but has been shown to get worse in group deliberation. One of the intriguing aspects of scenarios is that they may serve as counterfactuals, which have been demonstrated as one way to combat overconfidence. Third, brainstorming in groups has been shown to be subject to an effect called production blocking. This is an effect whereby interacting groups in a brainstorming setting actually brainstorm fewer ideas than the individuals in the group would have produced on their own. Group discussion limits generation of new alternatives. Intuitively, if I'm focused on the discussion of your idea, I'm not generating my own. As a largely deliberative approach, this could be a concern for scenario-based planning. Fourth, framing matters. There's a wealth of research in psychology and other related fields on framing effects. The most well-known example comes from characterizing an outcome as a gain versus a loss. people tend to be more risk-taking for losses and risk-averse for gains. Scenarios, if framed correctly, may help combat this. And then finally, I want to note on the relationship and almost the inseparability of cognition and affect or emotion when talking about risk perception. Something called the affect heuristic is a mental shortcut that people take when they're trying to judge how risky something is. And perhaps they don't have the time or the inclination to process that more completely. They query how their emotion about the situation. Am I worried? Am I nervous? Am I upset? These are taken as proxies for something being risky. The narrative nature of scenarios, which Jody will talk about more in a moment, very likely draw in affect quite effectively. And that's something to be aware of when using these approaches. So what's in the literature? Well, shockingly very little in the behavioral literature. You'll note that I used in the prior slides the terms may and could a lot. And that's because these effects have been largely understudied within the context of scenarios. And there's some major reasons for that. One of which is the samples that you would want. The people who are engaged in this type of decision-making are few in number, and the value of their time is very high. And so it's hard to do systematic psychological research with those populations. Secondly, the elements of the tasks that they are engaged in are complex and difficult to capture in an experimental setting. One key exception to this is a project that I was involved in, collaborating with Min Gong and Rob Lempert and others. And I think it provides a good, if limited, view into how I think research in this area should proceed. We conducted a laboratory experiment with a realistic fishery management task that asked participants to balance economic and environmental objectives. This was accomplished through a computer-based dashboard that participants were able to interact with, and particularly allowed them to explore a wide range of futures and construct policy options. We intentionally kept the option space quite large and fluid. There were actually 79 different possible combinations of policies that they could explore, 18 of which we identified as relatively high expected value. We randomly assigned participants to one of two experimental conditions. They either received displays that focused on scenarios, which the upper display, this figure here is a snippet from the dashboard for that, or one focused on forecasts, and the lower figure here is a snippet from that. So they were randomly assigned to one of those two conditions and allowed to explore and asked to choose a policy. We found that participants in both conditions made reasonable decisions. This was actually quite a comforting result. They explored the space similarly, and in equal numbers in the two conditions found high expected value solutions. Where they differed, though, was interesting. Those in the scenario condition chose strategies. They were more likely to identify 5 of those 18 strategies, which we had identified as and designed as more robust, i.e. they performed well over a wide range of futures. This is largely because they paid increased attention to worst case futures. As a secondary result here, in a post-experimental survey, those in the forecast condition compared to those in the scenario condition were more likely to endorse a statement that they tended to envision a single future and plan with that future in mind. So in terms of implication, using scenarios here rather than forecasts did encourage users to consider a wider range of futures, and the full information of the forecast approach, which was the only one that actually provided concrete likelihoods, didn't appear to help. Last, I'm going to finish up with some cautions. First, the narrative nature of scenarios, which Jody will discuss in more detail, may make it easier to recall or imagine those scenarios. This in turn may increase perceived likelihood. Hence, they should be chosen carefully. And in particular, they may, and for good reason, legitimize multiple viewpoints. After all, some rare cases may be worthy of consideration, but creating a false sense of equal likelihood may be one potential harm. Second, and related to the first point, scenarios likely take advantage of something called the conjunction fallacy. This is a perceptual effect where a conjunction of events, say A and B, feels more likely than either A by itself or B by itself. For example, a hot urbanized future may feel more real and hence more likely than either a hot future by itself or an urbanized future by itself. Scenarios as complex narrative objects are inherently conjunctions of events. Again, care should be taken to at least be cognizant of this effect. And finally, to the extent that decision processes are deliberative, protection should be taken to avoid production blocking. As a reminder, this is where consideration of a discussed idea blocks production of other ideas. Luckily, in the group decision-making literature, there are solutions that have been identified. One is to first brainstorm individually and then discuss the compiled list. Another remedy is heterogeneous groups, as they introduce more diversity in ideas, and similarly, consideration of countervailing evidence can protect against prior beliefs. Scenarios can represent differing viewpoints and hence have some very interesting promise here for combating these processes. I'm going to turn it over to Jody now.
Thanks, Andy. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start us off with a tale of the dodgy dossier to get us really thinking about the importance of uncertainty communication. I think some people in the audience might be familiar with this story. In 2002, the British government published a document claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and nuclear ambitions, which was used to justify going to war. However, after the war, this was found to be untrue. An investigation found that expressions of uncertainty in the intelligence were removed or not made clear enough in the public report. Similarly, in the US, a review found that the intelligence community did not accurately explain the uncertainties behind the judgments in their report. So the main idea is really this: the removal of uncertainty from the documents had a big impact on public opinion and governments, and was a key factor in the decision to go to war. Now, in DMDU, assessment of future risk generally contains a strong element of epistemic uncertainty, or put simply, this is uncertainty that arises from a lack of knowledge or understanding. So further knowledge would subsequently revise our predictions. This tale suggests that failure to do so can seriously compromise decisions, which is why it's important to stress the effects of communication on the audience through this cognitive psychological perspective that Andy and I are offering today. One question we might ask ourselves, or at least I've been continuously asking myself, is that, well, in the context of DMDU, how might we communicate the uncertainty in scenarios honestly and transparently without losing trust and credibility, to the benefit of stakeholders who subsequently use this information to form an opinion or make a decision? Next slide, please, Andy. Here I want to introduce a very basic model in communication, in the field of communication, known as the Laslaw's model of communication. This version has been adapted to communicate uncertainty, and it focuses on who communicate what, in what form, to whom, and with what effect. So starting from the left, the first two factors in the framework are about who is communicating. The owners of the uncertainty are the experts who assess the uncertainty, such as scientists or official bodies. The communicators might be the technical experts, communication professionals, and journalists who convey the information on behalf of the institutions. The factors related to what is being communicated might be the object that is uncertain, such as facts, numbers, or scientific models and hypotheses. The source for the uncertainty, such as the reasons for the lack of knowledge, the lack of uncertainty ranging from direct uncertainty about a fact to indirect uncertainty about the underlying science, and the magnitude of the uncertainty ranging from a small lack of precision to a substantial degree of ignorance. The factors related to the form of communication might be how the uncertainty is expressed, such as a full probability distribution or a brief mention that uncertainty exists. The format of the communication, such as numbers, visualizations, or verbal statements, and the medium of communication, such as print, online, broadcast, or verbal conversation. The factors related to whom the communication might include, to whom the communication include might be the characteristics of the audience, such as their level of numeracy and expertise in the field, the relationship of the audience to the topic, such as whether it is emotionally charged or contested, and the relationship of the audience to the communicators, including their perceived credibility and level of trust or distrust. The last set of factors is about the effect of the communication on the audience, including how it affects their thinking, emotions, trust, behavior, and decision-making. And this ties in with Andy's discussion of cognitive biases, because people's understanding of uncertainty can really vary greatly and have a big impact on their decision-making. Next slide, please. So as Andy also points out, there is shockingly also few research on how to communicate uncertainty effectively in DMDU. Thankfully, there's some hope. Recent research has looked at using scenarios as an effective communication tool. First, recall that scenarios describe a range of possible futures. Now, narrative theory argues that the stories we tell about ourselves and our experiences shape our identities and worldview. The authors propose that scenarios or narratives about how the world works and our role in it is important in shaping public opinion, policy, and politics related to the environment. These stories can be intentionally created and spread, or they can emerge and be reinforced through social relationships. In DMDU, decisions about the future are motivated less by accurate anticipation and risk assessments than collectively held narratives. So in many ways, narratives have the ability to extend cognition, create shared knowledge across space and time, shape our beliefs, values, and actions in the face of uncertainty. And because environmental decision-making grapple with deep uncertainty, the uncertain and contested nature of sustainability transition gives power to narratives. It gives psychological agency to narratives, which highlight certain contingencies, responsibilities, priorities, and pathways over others. And due to their persuasive abilities, there is a growing interest in using narratives in social sciences and climate research. Next slide, please. Here I want to show you some examples where narratives in the environmental context have conventionally been observed. First, we see them a lot in climate narratives. Scientists, journalists, activists, and other actors use stories with words, images, and statistics to make sense of observations or events. And as what Andy has pointed out about framing, how these stories are told can have a big impact, influencing whether people feel hope or fear, take action or do nothing, and feel uncertain or clear about the situation. For example, climate narratives can place responsibility on individuals or policymakers. We've seen them in narratives where they've argued that it's too late to act, or in narratives that emphasize the need to act now. They are also found embedded in cultural artifacts like folklore, songs, customs, and oral traditions that pass down norms from generation to generation. For example, research shows that folklores that highlight features of the physical environment, such as crop and water-related motifs in fertile areas or accounts of earthquakes in risk-prone areas, can shape shared knowledge, values, and ecological dynamics. Lastly, we also see them quite commonly in data visualizations that are often accompanied by other text or images. For example, in this graphic here, these are the warming strips created by Ed Hawkins in 2018. In 2018, and in blue it shows the cooler years, and in red it shows the warmer years. So the graphic is easily understood by a broad range of audiences without having much scientific information. Next slide, please. Here are two potential types of strategic narratives that can be leveraged when communicating uncertainty. The first is narratives of human agency and action. And typically, these narratives focus I'm sorry, my cat is just in the way. Sorry. Typically, these narratives focus on exceptional agency of humans, following themes such as how can we play a role in reshaping the Earth's surface? What is our dependence on Earth's system for our own well-being? We see them quite often in popular culture, in the growing genre of climate fiction, which creates psychologically immersive and visceral experiences of possible futures, including dystopic ones resulting from inaction and utopic ones resulting from systemic change. Some of my personal favorites are Star Trek and Silo. And then there are narratives of delay, uncertainty, and inaction. And these narratives highlight the difficulties related to knowledge and ethics because they build on real concerns and fears. They also prey on tendencies on decisions under uncertainty. Linguistic analyses show that these stories are influenced by the norms surrounding other social issues and a hierarchy of more abstract stories about freedom, responsibility, and social division. So in many ways, they favor the status quo and are more palatable among a broad range of audience. Next slide, please. So here I want to talk about some past work done at RAND. So we just concluded this project early this January, led by Melissa Keane, which I was a part of. And we were tasked to develop an issue paper on best practices for environmental risk communication and engagement with communities neighboring military installations. Based on risk communication frameworks, here were some of the best practices we proposed that I find to be helpful and could be applied and relevant to other contexts such as DMDU. Now, the first is to acknowledge the values, feelings, and worries expressed by the target stakeholders. This can really help build a solid partnership based on trust and credibility. The second is to recognize that target stakeholders are predisposed to distinct stresses and biases. This helps foster a communication approach that meet the needs of target stakeholders. Internal stresses may, for example, include a lack of literacy skills, while external stresses may include challenging economic factors or conditions. And biases, as Andy has pointed out, might also color perceptions of risk. Communication should also avoid jargon, explaining risk information in clear and consistent ways to minimize excessive fears and anxiety. Jargon and highly technical language can really hinder narrative comprehension by audiences. As a result, critical risk information and recommended actions may be misunderstood or ignored. Best practice suggests using terms and language that are familiar to the larger audience and focus on local and observable consequences described in non-probabilistic terms. The fourth is to incorporate tools to learn about the target concern. This increases the likelihood that narratives will be received more positively by the target audience. Explaining technical details through stories that resonate with stakeholders can really increase the likelihood that the information will be understood, personalized, and acted upon. And lastly, evaluate successes and failures to help ensure communication evolves as situations change and ideally improves over time. Regular monitoring and evaluation are necessary and should include the involvement of stakeholders in assessing narrative effectiveness, noting any reasons for changes in the narratives that could impact an organization's trust and credibility. Next slide, please. So to conclude, well, there's really no rest for the wicked. In our opinion, there's a need for continued exploration of cognitive psychological impacts of scenarios. And I like to end our talk here with a big picture question to really think about how can we construct scenarios and narratives in DMDU to understand how shared knowledge and values are shaped. For instance, myself, Rob Lampert, and Armando Molino at the U of Monterey, and alongside 3 experienced journalists, we've been really trying to get our hands wet on this topic. We do have an upcoming commentary to be published in Frontiers in Climate on how media narratives intersect with DMDU to inform and to leverage the complexities of modern contemporary public challenges. And one of the key ideas is to explore how uncertainty might be actionable as opposed to fearful. And we're proposing that narratives can be potent drivers that propel people to act according to or despite uncertainty. So stay tuned if you're interested. And with that, we will end here, and thank you so much for listening in.
Thank you very much. If we were in a big room, you get a big hand of applause right now. Yeah, I think that you covered a lot of territory there, and you covered a lot of ground of concerns I've heard from those who maybe are a little bit reticent to adopt this approach because of the fear of creating so much uncertainty that you do create inaction or scare stakeholders because you're focused on negatives. So I do really appreciate you bringing up all these issues. I want to open it up to questions. Let me just start with one, just to make sure people really, you did use a lot of terms and provide a lot of ideas. Let me just back up and ask one first question before we get to the group. Can you just back up and give us a definition of cognitive bias and what you think are some of the major concerns with cognitive bias?
Sure, right, and that's a good gap in the presentation. Like you said, we defined a lot of terms, and that's probably not one of them. The way that the field of behavioral decision research typically defines a cognitive bias is a result of a natural cognitive process that, or a cognitive process that results in a systematic deviation from what we refer to as normative decision making. Decision making as might be considered by rational models. And what I mentioned that the field tends to focus on a contrast between descriptive accounts of decision making and normative theories of decision making. Cognitive biases are really the result of natural cognitive processes that cause a deviation from those normative models.
And you gave an example, right? You said that people tend to see losses as bigger than gains, even if the magnitude's the same. So that's an example, right?
Right. So losses. So the classic framing effect studies contrasted two different presentations of risk information that were informationally equivalent to each other, whereas one focused on the losses and the other focused on the gains within the situation, and found that people tended to react very differently to those in two different ways. One, they tended to be risk seeking in the loss frame and risk averse in the gain frame, but also that the losses weighed heavier than the gains. So if you want to think of it this way, the slope of the utility function is greater in the loss frame than in the gain frame.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Okay, let's get to the board's questions. Diane.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I should explain, this is far from my area of research and knowledge, but we are the Delta Independent Science Board. So we're focused on the Bay Delta system, California's water issues. And to what extent is some of these scenarios that may be place-based or not place-based, does that influence the bias in terms of whether individuals also needing to make place-based decisions may consider the scenario impactful, or if it's not, does, like that color-coded blue-red example that didn't have any place context to it at all, does place matter, is I guess my broader question in this context.
Jody, do you have thoughts on that? I'm certainly happy to jump in.
I do have some thoughts. I think you raised a great question, but I am going to try my best to answer, but I'm not sure if it's also the most accurate answer. But it does make me think a lot about what Andy did touch on quite a bit, which is the idea of psychological distance, right? So psychological distance is really the degree to which people feel removed from a phenomenon. And so it reminds me a lot about the idea of the proximity, the distance to which whether people are closer to the issue at hand versus whether they are far removed from it. And that has an effect on how they take action or does not take action at the end of the day. So that's kind of like my small take on it, but Andy, if you could jump in.
Yeah, I'll offer a few thoughts on this as well. And I think it's a very, very good question. My initial reaction is that closeness to the problem, this being something that is in your own backyard, reduces that psychological distance that Jody mentioned, increases salience for the individual, and may increase connection with a variety of fairly strongly held beliefs and values. And as such, it's going to bring into play some of those things that I mentioned. So biases such as my side bias and confirmation bias really do play out more strongly when people have very strongly held beliefs and values. Similarly, recall is going to be greater for something that has greater salience to an individual. So and we know that recall is related to perceived likelihood. So something that is more valued to you, that is scarier because of that, perhaps, that has a greater salience to you, may be more memorable and hence may feel more likely. One of this of course speaks to the power of scenarios because it can engage stakeholders quite readily, but it also speaks to one of the things to keep your eye out for, which is where are likelihoods getting more and more, perceived likelihoods getting more and more divorced from reality. Did that answer your question?
Thanks, Tanya.
Yeah, thanks, Andy and Jody, for two great presentations. That's one of the takeaways I have from both of your presentations is that if we are using narrative-based scenarios, there are both some advantages, but also some potential risks with the narrative-based approach to scenarios, especially in terms of how those scenarios could either help us overcome some of the cognitive biases, or potentially how those narratives could even trigger or reinforce certain cognitive biases. And so I guess this raises some questions, some practical questions for me in thinking about, if you're a decision maker that's trying to buy into this idea of let's do some DMDU approaches and use scenarios more robustly, how much pre-work should be done before devising some scenarios to really understand the mental models that the stakeholders that you're going to be working with might have, and to really be thinking ahead of time about how the design of the scenarios, the narrative structure of those scenarios could potentially be triggering or overcoming some of those cognitive biases. And then, how long does it, how much work does this take then to really get the scenarios right so that you're kind of hitting that sweet spot to encourage the type of advantages that I think Andy laid out so nicely, the potential advantages that you could achieve from scenarios. So, yeah.
We conducted another study some years before the one that I reported, where we also presented, we were mostly interested in how people react to analytically derived scenarios. So these are a lot of sort of modern DMDU methods, as I perceive them, are take advantage of simulation and computational capabilities to analytically derive policy relevant scenarios. And we were very interested in how people, in this case, the public, received this. And one of the really interesting parts of that study was that people generally liked the idea of analytically derived scenarios. This was when we were actually presenting them with these and trying to show them different outputs from some of these types of scenario discovery methods, and they generally liked them. But mostly when the types of dimensions that were characterized in those scenarios were intuitive. Now, in hindsight, this makes total sense, and it may have been obvious, but it took us a while to discover it. But it's very possible when you're doing some sort of multi-dimensional analysis that you come up with dimensions that are hybrids of a bunch of natural things and that don't really make sense to the average human. Those weren't very helpful. What was really helpful were when they aligned with concepts that were relatively straightforward. And so things like wetter or drier, hotter or colder, more urbanized versus less urbanized, those kinds of, and you can imagine a variety of underlying factors that would all kind of align with that. So if you're thinking of this as, you know, as we were at the time thinking of this as a rotation in space of a multidimensional result, it was saying, okay, maybe we accept a slightly less than optimal rotation if it better aligns with the original axes that we started with. And that was a pretty clear result from that study. So to get to your point, at least, hopefully partially at least, in terms of that pre-work, I think that analytically derived scenarios are a good idea. But having some care into how those are constructed and how they, and again, I think this is where it gets into the idea of narrative. Does this something tell a natural story? If it does, it's going to be a more engaging and more effective scenario.
Yeah, and can I just chime in a little bit there? Sure. So when I think deeper about the construction of narratives, I think we can certainly benefit more from working with researchers or scholars and people who have dedicated their lives to this line of work. So for instance, in the field of communication, there are certainly narrative experts, and they'll tell you that constructing a good narrative is much more complex than we think, because done the right way, these narratives can kind of hit the sweet spot, like you said. They can model or inform the kind of action that people might take. So I think it's really as much of an art as it is science. And really, to clarify, we're not suggesting that, you know, narratives are everything. Among the broader audience, one's opinion on different environmental issues depend on many other factors, but all these factors, they all act in concert with a story that can capture people's imagination, right? So even if we do not know about all the factors and processes by which a narrative can gain traction with the public over time, we can certainly observe its presence today.
Thank you, Jody. Go ahead, Obey.
Yeah, thank you. Nice presentation, although it's very dense for me because of my engineering background. I'm trying to connect to all the concepts that you have laid out. So I'm going to try to connect this to the real place-based system we have, which is the Delta system, right? So a couple of things that I would like you to explain. One is the production blocking concept, and I didn't understand that very clearly, but here's a scenario. We're trying to come up with a range of plausible scenarios, and some of them could be, you know, what we call black swans or very extreme scenarios that you cannot even associate any probabilities as the DMDU goes. But then there is a community or stakeholder community that may not be very interested in those scenarios. Either they're not useful or there's not much you can do, but yet they might be important because of the, you know, irreversible implications it could have on those. So my question is, how do you convince the community to look at that range of scenarios which are both plausible and also plausible scenarios that are very rare, but there might be a reluctance to look at those scenarios, and what would the risk communication strategy would look like in that case so that we can convince them to be open to those complete range? I don't know if you understood my question, but I want to connect it to our system.
Yeah, I think I kind of understood the question. So I think, first of all, it's a really big question, and it really depends on who you're trying to communicate to. And also it depends on the issue that you're trying to communicate, right? So this relates to the project that we've been working on and some of the best practices that we've come up with that I talked about close to the end of my presentation. First of all, I think it's important to really recognize that the people that we're trying to communicate to are predisposed to a lot of stresses and biases. So trying to evaluate the demographics of who you're communicating to can really foster an approach that really meets their needs. So I've given examples on how, you know, some of the internal stresses that people might face are their level of literacy skills, or external factors that could include challenging economic factors or conditions that they're personally facing. And then Andy has also pointed out about the cognitive biases that could color their perceptions of risk. So whether, you know, confirmation bias and all the good stuff. So knowing your audience is definitely one way to engage this risk communication framework and approach and try to build into it. And there's certainly other ways as well. You know, you have to acknowledge the values and the feelings and the worries expressed by target stakeholders. And one of the ways that we do to help build a solid partnership based on trust and credibility is to work with people in the community, have them go down there and interview them about what they're facing, and if there's any feelings or worries that are expressed to them, and really listen. And so these are kind of like the two ways that I would propose. Not sure if that at least answered your question partially, but Andy, if you have done any community-based projects, you might want to chime in here.
A couple of thoughts on this, and I think just to build off of some of what you said, I think the idea of co-production with communities who are concerned is a very powerful way to go about this. Getting them involved in the scenario design is. I also think that this is where hopefully some of the focus on possibility rather than probability can help get people on board with considering things as. I mean, I frankly would be honest that something is a very low likelihood event, or low but low and unknowable in terms of likelihood, given the deep uncertainty. But considering the possibility will help for exploring policy options that may be robust to even those relatively unthinkable situations. I think that in my mind, that's the path forward, or hopefully a path forward is not to pretend that they're going to buy into the scenario, but get them to the point where they're willing to consider it as part of a robustness kind of goal. And I think that's but having them involved and having it will definitely, I believe, help with buy-in.
Thanks, Andy and Jody. So we only have a few minutes left. Tom, if you could just hold on, I want to check and see if we have any public questions, and then hopefully maybe our speakers can stay a few more minutes, but I don't want to ignore the public entirely. Edmund, who do we have any questions?
We have one public question lined up, but just a reminder to those attending the call, if you do have a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. And before you ask your question, please briefly introduce yourself. Thank you. Deirdre, you have the ability to unmute your microphone.
Hi, this is Deirdre Dan with California Water Research, and I just wanted to raise the issue of the USGS arc storm scenario, which was put together as a something like the Great Flood of 1862. And I think the simulations were completed in 2010, and they showed extreme flooding in western Sacramento city, as well as the Delta and the western part of Stockton. And climate change has made that more likely. And Daniel Swain has a study that there's a 50% chance of a flood at least as large as the Great Flood of 1862 in the next 40 years. And so it's not even a gray rhino. There's probably more than 50-50 chance that it will occur. And we've been seeing extreme flooding all around the world. And Chris Cox did an article with the New York Times where he documented that the Department of Water Resources had a contract with a external contractor to do hydraulic routing of the arc storm flows and verify the hypothetical flooding. And they just, quote, ghosted, unquote, the arc storm scenario about 3/4 of the way through. And it's just a huge issue. And I was telling the Metropolitan Water District Board, it's much more likely than the earthquake scenario in the Delta. And the Delta tunnel intakes are not being designed to withstand it. And a multi-hazard analysis would consider this as one of the largest hazards in the Delta, and it's just not being considered as a hazard to water exports. And there is an estimate of how long it would take to dewater various islands. But this is something I think the board should really look at, not just hesitancy by environmental stakeholders about risk of salmon extinction, but very large, major disaster. And the other one is the risk that the current pattern of hot droughts continue. And Southwest scientists and Colorado River managers and East Coast tropical cyclone scientists are all recommending scenario-based approaches where that current pattern continues. And I've been digging more into some of the reasons that it might continue, but that also isn't even being considered by the Department of Water Resources, even though it was requested as part of the last climate adaptation plan and was produced.
Thank you, Deirdre, thank you. I think you're raising a really important point. Let me turn this into a question for our speakers. So we do see this reticence to look at extreme events and also negative scenarios in general in the ongoing activities. Do you have any suggestions about how we motivate? You know, I understand you're talking a lot about co-production and the idea being that there's plenty of opportunity to have a dialogue about the benefits or harms of using such scenarios, but is there another answer beside that to motivating people to look at more extreme events?
Jody, I'm really intrigued by the idea that you said about reframing a problem in terms of action as opposed to risk or loss. And the as a means of you know, is there going to be scenarios that are on the one hand sort of unthinkable for one reason or another, politically or otherwise, and that are and hence there may be reticence to take it on, but a reframing of that scenario in terms of action, I think, is one way that that you might approach that. It might be a slightly different answer. And Jody, I'm putting words in your mouth because this is part of what you were talking about, but I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
I didn't particularly first thought about the reframing idea, but I did immediately think about, what Deirdre brought up. It's and what we've been constantly discussing about, which is really the public perception of how do I put it? So I think it's really more about the idea of reducing the psychological distance. So I'll give an example using climate change that's been really talked about a lot. So for example, when we think of having like an abstract level, it usually leads to climate change being perceived as really far away, right? Like a concept that is psychologically distant. And this results in kind of this dissension of the problem and the unwillingness to tackle the issue. But on the other hand, if we are able to kind of draw the distance closer, then it leads to a higher likelihood of acceptance of climate change by lay people, by the public, or stakeholders, through promoting a more psychologically closed view, which in communication research we've done a lot. And I know Dr. Janet Yang is in the audience today, and she's a climate researcher who's done a lot of work in psychological distance and how to address this issue. But I think making the issue, this issue of any type of topic issue more localized, more relevant, and more urgent will really kind of help to reduce the struggles and estrangement by people and help to increase pro-environmental behaviors. So if we can reframe the narrative to reduce the psychological distance that people experience, this could be one way.
Thank you. I want to note that we are a few minutes past time. Jody and Andrew, can you stay for a few more minutes for these last questions?
Sure thing.
Okay, great. Yep. All right. So Tom, why don't you ask your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation. My career was spent dealing with earthquakes, and for a long time we couldn't get anybody to do much about it. But then we had the Loma Prieta earthquake, and all of a sudden the scenarios that were much worse than the Loma Prieta earthquake became relevant. So it seems to me that you need to pick your timing for the scenarios. That we know we're going to have floods in California, and rather than talk about an arc storm on just a random basis, connect it with a real flood so people are seeing a lot of the damage that can be done. So that you need to pick the timing of the scenarios to make them effective.
Thanks, Tom. I think that's a great observation. I think it really jives well with Jody's point about psychological distance. It's something that if you have a salient event, that it's certainly going to be a motivator. And connecting it to real world events, even if it's a more extreme scenario, those events which have affected people's lives will certainly increase the salience and their willingness to connect with those scenarios.
Thanks, Sandy. Diane, before you go, I just want to ask Edmund, do we have other public questions?
There are none.
Okay, great. Go ahead, Diane.
Again, I was wondering how you deal in these scenarios with the extent of potential loss of life and livelihood. How does that influence willingness to engage in co-production of scenarios or to think about scenarios, because some of the scenarios that may be relevant for the Delta could involve loss of life and livelihood.
I think a general truism in terms of, or sort of a basic tenet of risk communication, at least from my experience, and Jody, I'm at risk of treading on your toes here, but is that candor and honesty in risk communication is sort of a bedrock thing that you need to do to have folks trust you. And so shying away from bad outcomes is going to come across as out of touch. So I think that acknowledging risks and being honest about them is, even if it's something that is particularly scary, is a place that I would want to start from.
Thanks. Oh, looks like Obe has another question, and then I would like to ask one more.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment on, I think what was suggested, probably Tom, using historical data, historical events as a way to, maybe it would be easier to communicate that type of event, what would happen, those under climate change scenarios. That's what we call storyline approach. But the problem with that is that there could be other compounding effects of those historical events that could be a lot worse than the historical event by itself. And if you just use a storyline approach alone, that might not capture the other potential compounding effects on the warming scenarios. So in case of climate change, just a comment on that.
Yeah, and if you have a changing system, you maybe have an absence of historical events that are in the space that you want to actually consider.
I'd like to ask a question about, you mentioned this problem of people, you present a series of scenarios, some of them may be highly improbable, and decision makers treat them all as equally likely. So on the one hand, that could be dangerous if people start making inefficient investments. But on the other hand, I think you had a positive case study, sort of a little bit of a manipulation, I guess, of your audience, in that when you gave them the probabilities, they only focused on, the central tendency type scenario. And then when you gave them scenarios, they were more like, you said they were more likely to look across futures and find a solution that was robust across futures, which I think is kind of the benefit of thinking about the improbable conditions, is if you can protect against the extreme condition without spending that much more than you would have for the best guess scenario, then you're in good shape, right? So is it really a horrible thing to have people misinterpret that, or is it sometimes beneficial?
Two thoughts on that. First of all, as I recall, we were fairly careful to express to them that just because these scenarios were being presented next to each other, they weren't necessarily equally likely. They were just scenarios to consider. So I don't think that we weren't encouraging them to think of them as equally likely. That's certainly the case. It is true in that study, they were more likely to explore that area of the space and be able to discover some of the things that you're talking about. Because they explored that area of the space, the policy space, they were able to discover things like, whoa, we could cover our butts on this whole area that's unlikely but scary for not much extra cost. And if we went this way. And that's where they landed on the more robust solutions in many ways. So I think that there's a real element of truth in that. And I think that there's a fine line to walk here between not focusing, not starting with likelihood, not putting that forward as an organizing concept, but at the same time, be open to the idea that these things have varying probabilities. Okay,
Tom, you're going to get the last word here. Well, other than Andy and Jody.
Okay, this is going to be off the wall. I was thinking.
Don't make me regret this, Tom.
We may. I was thinking of the last 2 months, we've actually been running or setting up an experiment. When you think of what happens in a trial, and we've had 4 indictments now, some of them come with what they call speaking indictments. And what they're basically doing is describing a scenario that they're going to try and convince a group of people are true, get them to accept it. The defense attorney is going to be doing just the opposite. He may come up with another alternative, another scenario, or try to insert uncertainty into the prosecutor's scenario. Can we learn anything from process that those people are going through?
My gut reaction is that this is kind of similar to a news story having two people next to each other, two talking heads that are presenting opposing views, one of which is much more supportive than the other, or maybe more supportive than the other. And the concern that you're giving equal airtime to those. I think there's an analogy here for scenarios that are, I mean, this is, I think, wherein lies the tension is scenarios for low consequence or low probability, high consequence events in particular have maybe very worth considering in deliberation. But at the same time, and I think there are some benefits to that if it allows exploration of those areas of the space. But at the same time, we don't want to create a false equivalence, and that's, I think that's where I think you were going with this, and I think that we see this in different types of communicative settings that maybe I'm not familiar with that part of that aspect of those legal proceedings, but it sounded a lot like the sort of two talking heads thing on a newscast, and I think there needs to be a degree of plausibility to the scenarios, even the low probability ones, and a reason for them to be there. And I think that's gonna resonate with decision makers as well. There needs to be a reason why those scenarios matter.
Well, what I was thinking was if you looked at the outcomes from a whole bunch of these trials, not the ones in the last few months that have been so publicized, but just look at them as a data set. It would seem like there's going to be sometimes where the defendant wins, and trying to see what were the controlling factors that led to their victory in the trial, because they're actually coming up against something that has shallow uncertainty that they managed to do something, you know.
I think you're hitting. There's an element of this that I think is actually that I'd like to highlight here. That's a competitive environment between the lawyers. They're actually competing with each other in that setting, and so they have incentives to create scenarios that manipulate decisions in particular directions. Now, that may be true in the policy space too, but in many situations, it's at least hopefully more collaborative or more cooperative rather than competitive. There's a well-being at the end of the day. That's people may have different goals and different beliefs around those, but I do think that it's an interesting question as to whether or not the folks who are putting forward different scenarios actually see themselves as competing with each other. If that's the case, I think that's actually something to address itself.
Yeah.
Well, that would certainly be the case in climate change, with climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Tom, and thanks to our speakers. I just want to add to that last point, though, is that in many ways, we want to understand these cognitive biases so that we don't inadvertently manipulate people, right? You know we can scare them more easily with losses than with gains. And so if we frame things as losses, we are pushing them toward a particular action. And so I think it's almost like we're trying to do the opposite with these scenarios, is try to avoid triggering people in certain ways. So
I remember the first time I was in a grocery store and I saw a package of ground beef that was labeled 80% lean, 20% fat. Like, it actually had both labels on it. And I was like, this was a study that was run by Erwin Levin, a psychologist in Iowa, some years ago. I was like, I took a photograph of it and sent it to him because he's a friend. And I said, and I'm like, finally somebody got it right. Because what he had shown was that people thought ground beef. He found that people that saw ground beef labeled as 80% lean thought it was better ground beef than people that saw it as labeled as 20% fat. And he ran a condition where he gave both pieces of information, and it seemed to have a lot of promise to it. So to your point, Lisa, I think you're absolutely right. That part of this is just being aware of these cognitive biases and trying to be cognizant that the scenarios, the construction, that we don't inadvertently build those things into this.
Yeah. Okay, well, this has been fascinating. I learned a lot from your talks, and really appreciate you taking the time to help us with this review and help us work toward better scenarios in the Delta. So thank you again.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate it. So, okay, we're going to let you go. We've taken up enough of your time.
Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.